Okay, hello everyone. Just before our guest speaker starts today, I just wanted to sort of a bit of an introduction. Publishing platforms have blurred, enabling artists and designers to explore and communicate subjects through a wide range of disciplines to their designated audiences. Printed publications, converted solely to digital communication, have altered our relationship with the printed word and image. Questioning our expectations through the immediacy of information and assessing whether graphic design can cope with this impatience. I wanted to talk about a little bit about a recent publication that aligns with what Teal is going to be talking about today. Sharing the same paperback format as the previous two titles, the recently published printed survey conducted by Graphic Design and provides a fascinating glimpse into many aspects of the UK's design industry and reveals the gender gap that isn't restricted solely to the practitioners' wages and salaries. The experiences and differences between male and female graphic designers is a theme which is a thread throughout this book, not just in the section devoted specifically to gender. Data within the study shows that the majority of women believe that the graphic design industry is a masculine culture, whereas most men saw it as a neutral playing field. Okay? These contemporary issues and questions are being probed in our studios and discussed, and in particular, in the development of the extensive programme events being explored and coordinated by F Equals, which will take place on and around International Women's Day on the 8th of March. Discussing some of those issues raised in the publication and within academic and professional studios. The Women's Designer Research Unit collaborative practice that is coordinated by Sian Cook and our speaker today, Teal Triggs, through the exploration and communication of self-initiated projects. Formed in the early 90s when graphic designers were becoming increasingly vocal about social responsibility and, and politics of design, this paradigm shift in how designers employed their skills as authors, facilitators, and transmitters of the published word. Professor Teal Triggs is an educator, historian, and writer whose research focuses primarily on graphic design history, design research methods, self-publishing, and feminism. Here today to discuss the politics of self-publishing and the engagement and participation of women, please welcome Professor Teal Triggs.
Great. Many thanks. Thanks to Simon for the initial invitation, and also to Justin for that lovely introduction. I'm really, really pleased to be here. It's been a few years since I've been to Leeds, but I had some involvement many years ago with the Art and Design College. So I'm really thankful that I've been able to come back up again. It's a great city, and I enjoy seeing what's going on here, and I hope I have a chance to talk to some of you afterwards about what you are doing on your respective programs. This is a talk from a very personal perspective, rather than any in-depth academic look at feminist history. I think there's lots of amazing books out there about feminist history if you want to know more. But it does draw on a history, and it takes a researcher's perspective, moi. My aim is to explore the role of self-publishing and activism by looking at independent magazines that emerged out of the 1970s and 80s feminist movement, and again in the 1990s with the Riot Grrrl fanzines, but also how feminism and its graphic language has informed our work in the Women's Design and Research Unit, to which Justin has just referred. So my talk is divided into three parts. The first part, I look at recent debates around the use of the pronouns I and we, and I think it's a very important distinction to make, and we'll talk about that in a minute. In part two, I explore some of the key examples in feminist magazines and fanzines, so give you kind of an applied look at how perhaps I and we are being used. And then lastly, I'd like to propose a brief discussion on participatory cultures, using the Women's Design Research Unit as an example of how feminist principles can be used in the services of design. And I'll look at two specific projects that were research-oriented, undertaken by WDRU. So, to start the talk, last weekend I became fascinated by the op-ed column published in the New York Times by seasoned author and journalist Maureen Dowd, which had the headline, as you see here, "When Hillary Clinton Killed Feminism." Now, I don't know if you've been following the debate at all, but as her starting point, Dowd related the story of the previous week, where signs of a growing unease brought about generational differences was making news. The controversy began with what were taken as gender-biased comments by America's stalwart feminists Madeleine Albright and Gloria Steinem in two separate campaign incidents. Albright, a former Secretary of State for the US, reached for her trademark phrase during a Clinton rally in New Hampshire. She said, "There's a special place in hell for women who don't help each other." Now, this remark, while seemingly appropriate to a rally cry for a past context of 1970s feminist struggle, today seemed tired and outmoded. And for me, the subsequent media spin overshadowed the real issues for young women today. For example, the issues of student debt, gay rights, and a more flexible view of gender. Albright later apologized in Time magazine that, quote, she did not mean to argue that women should support a particular candidate based solely on gender. In the same week, a second controversial remark took place during the popular American talk show program hosted by Bill Maher, where feminist icon, journalist, and co-founder of Ms. Magazine, Gloria Steinem, was guest. Mayer asked Steinem her opinion as to why the former Secretary of State, in this case Clinton being the former secretary, isn't doing better amongst young women. Steinem observed, and I quote, "Where women are more for Clinton than men are. Men tend to get more conservative because they gain power as they age. Women get more radical because they lose power as they age. They're going to get more activist as they grow older. And when you're younger, you think, where are the boys? The boys are with Bernie." And in this case, Bernie Sanders, who's the candidate running against Clinton. Now, the talk show host didn't miss a beat in questioning what Steinem actually meant in these observations. Was it felt that young women weren't serious in their politics, he asked. Steinem's reply sent Twittersphere alight. If you were following the breaking story, you will have noticed that the Albright-Steinem comments were quickly disseminated through digital publishing platforms, online blogs and newspapers, Twitter and Facebook. There was a sense of immediacy given over to the comments and subsequent critiques that were played out very publicly. Like Albright, Steinem later apologized, but for many, the generational divide between the perceptions of older feminist positions and their younger counterparts was widening. But such is the cycle of history where feminist practice occurs. According to Sadie Waring in her essay, Subjects of Rejuvenation, Aging and Post-Feminist Culture, generational politics is central to the past and future of feminism. She observes that in a post-feminist age, younger feminists tend to disidentify with a previous generation of feminists. This, she argues, has the potential to lead to a premature demise of feminism itself. Just today, the lead story in the New York Times reads, "Hillary Clinton's candidacy reveals generational schism amongst women." The author of the piece has interviewed a group of university students, each of whom shares a different perspective on feminism. One student remarked, "I couldn't even tell you what feminism is. I don't find gender that important." Another one says, she is definitely a feminist and cites that reproductive rights are her top priority. We are certainly at a juncture in the history of feminist thinking. Now, Dowd's New York Times opinion piece also reminds us of how the pronouns I and we are not only used as campaign rhetoric, but as signifiers of a feminist positioning. In an analysis of the candidate Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton's campaign rhetoric, Dowd asserts that Bernie has a clear, concise we message, whereas Hillary has an I message. In other words, Dowd sees Clinton's position as coming from a place of entitlement. Whilst the we perhaps evokes a collective voice, it also questions to whom does we refer, and asks which perceptions for which women. Herein lays the problem for feminists and politicians alike. How do we know who is included and who is excluded from the notion of the we? The notion of we also aligns with many who feel that we are entering a new post-gender world, where identifying as a woman is no longer a given. In a world where young people increasingly refuse to identify as one gender or another, the inclusive we is more important than ever. Of course, this does not obviate the need for feminism, as Judith Butler has argued. It is possible to mobilize under a feminist banner in these circumstances. Now, feminism is often associated with the idea of the collective we, and here's a model of empowerment that proposed the development of an anti-hierarchical structure as found within collective working, collective living, or collective support. Most famously is the nonprofit Women's Building in Los Angeles, founded in 1973 by the artist Judy Chicago, the art historian Arlene Raven, and graphic designer Sheila Lavrant de Bretteville as an independent school. And those of you that know Sheila's work, she's head of design at Yale and has been there for quite some time, being involved in a lot of social design activities and interventions and activism. Now, although the Women's Building closed in 1991, its legacy was twofold in the way that it brought together the arts and making skills, such as visual arts, writing, performance, video, printing, and graphic design, into one working space. And then secondly, how it brought the arts and supporting services directly to many working women. And this was really new in the 70s, to begin to build a community of arts practitioners and theorists under one roof. Now, there's a lineage to the notion of the we in feminist history, but also as it is used today in the different ways that designers are taking into account more collaborative, co-participatory practices. I'd like to return to this notion of the collective later in the paper in a discussion of some of my own work as part of the Women's Design and Research Unit. But first, I'd like to turn to explore the I and the we in terms of design, publishing, and feminist-inspired publications. The term collective and how it relates to action has also been important for feminism. Collective action is acknowledged as a powerful tool for social, political, and economic change. Today, social media networks such as Facebook and Twitter, and bottom-up economic models, including crowdsourced funding, swapping, and bartering, represent new platforms for collective action. But this notion of the power of collective action played out much earlier in the production of feminist-inspired publications, both underground and in the mainstream. Now, we don't have time today to go through a whole history of feminist zines and magazines, but I would like to highlight one or two which, for me, brought debates around some of the ideas of collective action to the foreground. In an age when the personal became political, Ms. Magazine, co-founded in 1971 by Gloria Steinem, the one and the same with the comments about Clinton I spoke about earlier, was the first periodical to be created, owned, and operated entirely by women. Ms. was introduced as a 40-page insert into the already popular New York Magazine, which is seen here. And this is the cover of that with the cover of the Ms. insert on the cover of the New York Magazine. Now, it was a clever marketing campaign which launched this platform, which spoke for a generation of women. On the magazine's own website, the publication's editor claims, Ms. was the first national magazine to make feminist voices audible, feminist journalism tenable, and a feminist worldview available to the public. The first test copy sold 300,000, and it sold out as an issue in 8 days. But it dealt with head-on subjects of feminist concerns. And according to the magazine, Ms. claims to have had a number of firsts in feminist publishing. And these included, and this is off the website, so this is, take it for what it is in terms of their own positioning. But some of these, I think, are quite significant in terms of the history of feminist publishing. So their contributions, for example, were demanding the repeal of laws that criminalized abortion, the first to explain and advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment in the US, to rate presidential candidates on women's issues, to put domestic violence and sexual harassment on the cover of a women's magazine, to feature feminist protest of pornography, to commission and feature a national study on date rape, and to blow the whistle on the undue influence of advertising on magazine journalism. Has anything actually changed? The publication is still in production today and recently celebrated its 40th anniversary issue. And I've included the juxtaposition of these two images to show you that Ms. also had a sense of humor. And I think that's absolutely important, particularly as a graphic designer working in this field. And both of these covers parody the feminist icon Wonder Woman, an image itself taken from the original comic book created by the psychologist William Moulton Marston, with drawings by Harry G. Peter in the 1940s. Now, Wonder Woman was an anomaly amongst other comic superheroes of the time, and Marston himself wrote, "Not even girls want to be girls so long as our feminine archetype lacks force, strength, and power. Not wanting to be girls, they don't want to be tender, submissive, peace-loving, as good women are. Women's strong qualities have become despised because of their weakness. The obvious remedy is to create a feminine character with all the strength of Superman, plus all the allure of a good and beautiful woman." Remember, this is the 1940s. It's also worth noting that Wonder Woman, who you see here with the lasso, the golden lasso, was used to encourage criminals to tell the truth. So it wrapped around the criminal, and then the criminal would kind of spill the beans. But it's also worth noting that Marston himself was the inventor of the lie detector test. So I think interesting in terms of invention and its representation in Wonder Woman. Now, in Britain, the magazine Spare Rib launched in July 1972 and ran until 1993 with regular features, reviews, poetry, and fiction by established and emerging female writers. The magazine, as we saw with the American Ms., also operated as a collective of women supporting the efforts of the women's liberation movement. Marcia Rowe and Rosie Boycott were co-founders and viewed the magazine's main focus as reinforcing the women's movement mantra, "The personal is political." Its British-based writers shared similar approaches to issues of Ms., with articles confronting debates on gender roles, sexuality, sexism, racism, anorexia, genital female mutilation, and so forth. The interior pages were a cross between underground broadsheets of the 1960s and 70s, but also graphically captured what is now a recognizable graphic style for a broader sector of political and countercultural publications. For examples, producers employed the use of hand-drawn typography, letraset, and the use of collage illustrations, creating a sense of immediacy of the message. This style is also seen in other collective publications, including Shocking Pink, which ran about the same time frame as Spare Rib. Now, I can't resist showing you a cover of this issue of Spare Rib from September 1982, which again picks up on the original Wonder Woman character, by now an established figure in the graphic language of feminism. The Mickey Mouse figure held by Wonder Woman and the dot screen that you see behind her in green and pink, which morphs into dots and stars, positions us firmly within a vocabulary of popular culture. You can also see in the left-hand corner the words "where the action is." Now, this is a box which is a reference to the Comics Code Authority, which allowed comic book publishers to self-regulate. If you want to know more about Spare Rib, it's exciting that the British Library has just digitized the full collection of the publication and is now available online. And I think for those of you that are interested in looking at a graphic language of politics, this is a really nice immediate way of getting a good sense of what was happening during the period and what kind of techniques were being used to convey some of these activist concerns. Now, the feminist magazine Collective became a powerful publishing platform during the 1970s and 1980s. And by the 1990s, as Spare Rib was actually winding down, which ceased publication in 1993, the murmurings from a new wave of underground press producers was emerging. Instead of trying to reach a wider distribution with printed magazines, the producers of this new feminist girl-style revolution now chose a more hands-on approach, returning to the roots of earlier efforts of Spare Rib and Shocking Pink. And increasingly, women producing fanzines for their bands gave a nod to punk's 1970s anti-establishment, do-it-yourself ethos. Anyone can play a chord, and anyone can produce a zine. The format, normally A4 or A5 of printed fanzines, became a key vehicle for the promotion of new wave feminist values, steeped in this refreshing new movement called Riot Girl. And how many Riot Girls do we have in the audience? No? I can't believe, not a single one? One? Excellent, thank you. Okay, so is this new to you, or is this something that you're familiar with? New? So we really have reached a generational divide. No? Okay, great. The Riot Girls, and I'll talk mainly about American and UK Riot Girl fanzines. Although it is worth noting, this was and still is an international movement. It's not particular to the Anglo-American axis. It really does go worldwide. But in terms of what they stood for, was very much about taking the 1970s feminist values, but updating it. It's the contemporary version of it. And they also took clues from 1970s punk, and it was about the kind of DIY ethos, but very much a part of a participatory culture, so that like-minded individuals were coming together and sharing their concerns, whether it had to do with sexuality, the body, or whether it had to do with politics, who was in office, what was happening, and so forth. So these kind of communities were beginning to emerge internationally of women who wanted to make a difference. This is part of their manifesto, which I know you can't see very well, but they produced several of these, which were very bold statements about what they believed in. And I think graphically what's interesting here for me is that the rally cry of these young women who call themselves Riot Girls adopted this graphic device of moving from the word girl, G-I-R-L, to the word girl, as described by using 3 R's. And the intention there was to graphically reflect the angry nature using a guttural growl. So the fact that typography could then become oral was quite important to actually make these rather bold statements. The format of the zines is literally drawn from the conventions of women's magazines. Media imagery was used from women's mainstream magazines along with cut-ups from newspapers. And zines often reflected, say, for example, the table of content format used by women's magazines, including sections on reviews, which were either poetry or books, but mainly the different bands that were beginning to emerge. They had a reader's page, so that notion of interacting with their readership was very important, and also include then quite serious feature stories. Yet, unlike the readers of girls' or women's mainstream magazines, the Riot Girl producers were proactive in setting out a political position of empowerment. So it's very much about taking control and where their voice would appear and how it would appear. So in Riot Girl, we see the formation of a strong participatory culture where anyone who expressed an interest in participating could do so. Now, Henry Jenkins, who's an academic, his own PhD study had been primarily on women who were involved in fan fiction as writers around the very much celebrated TV show Star Trek. Now, he defined a participatory culture as one in which members believe their contributions matter and feel some degree of social connections with each other. And this is really important if you start thinking about the role of Riot Girl and how they came together, who got involved and why and so forth. But this approach is also very much key to the success of the Riot Girl zine movement, even today where these productions circulate to like-minded individuals, what they want to say, and that's important, it's that notion of empowerment. And in a way, these zines are operating outside the mainstream fashion and consumer cultures, and very intentionally. and they're also pretty much operating below critical radar. So they're coming amongst various groups of people who don't necessarily want to put it out into the mainstream. And that's quite powerful in terms of grassroots political activism. So what do these things look like? Now, those of you who are interested in this area and in music may know about Bikini Kill, which was an American riot grrrl group formed in Olympia, Washington in 1990 with Kathleen Hanna, who's recently made a resurgence, Billy Karen, Kathy Wilcox, and Toby Vale. Now, Rebel Girl was one of their songs and became an anthem for the movement. Now, the band's approach to music epitomized the rise of new feminism in the States, and with it, their zine, Bikini Kill, was there to be used as a voice for those publications, or for their own kind of ways of thinking. And riot grrrls were very famous in terms of not wanting to speak to mainstream journalists, for example, if they were in a band, that they would prefer speaking to zine producers about what they were doing. So again, it was a way of kind of keeping it in the underground and keeping them empowered and under control of how they wanted to represent themselves. And I think this notion of authorship is very important through the zine producers' work. Jigsaw was produced in 1988, just slightly before the riot grrrl movement started, by Toby Vale. So she was very much involved in a number of zines. And it focused initially on the punk scene on the Pacific West Coast. And here she promoted bands such as Nirvana, which is very much a contemporary of the riot grrrls. I've also got an image of the cover of Girl Germs, and that was produced by members of the band Bratmobile, which included Alison Wolfe and Polly Newman. And like most zines of the time, contributors were often zine producers, but also contributors to other zines. So you see this kind of network beginning to form where communities of zine writers, designers, illustrators, as well as editors was emerging, but they all kind of were interwoven in their practices. So you get this kind of like-minded notion of musicians coming together because they were very interested in creating a particular kind of movement, but also writers and artists. Now, one of my favorite zines, which was a rather long-running zine, and you have to think most zines were produced in very short, limited runs, and it depended as and when the producer felt like producing them. So it didn't have the same kind of steady publication timetable as most mainstream magazines. But that, I think, is what gives its charm and is something about when the producers wanted something to put out for others to have conversations about. So Agamemnon Mogi is done by Kaz Blaze. And she was very much at the beginning of the riot grrrl movement in this country, and in a way has kind of become the custodian of the riot grrrl movement's history, because her publication was very much about the observations she was making, the conversations that she was having with various bands and various producers of other zines within the riot grrrl movement. And she's gone on to write as a freelance journalist, and her latest piece for the F Word, which is an online magazine for feminists, she's done an interview with Karen Ablaze. And here we have an early issue of Ablaze that Karen produced. And her first indie music zine came out in 1987, and again ran until about 1993. Whilst it's affiliated more with the indie scene in music, it also championed in the early issues of its publication ideas about feminism, and then it morphed into talking about quite strongly the riot grrrl movement. Now, after a long hiatus, Karen has recently resurrected the zine with issue number 11, 2016. So she's had a break from, almost a couple of decades from producing the zine in the 90s and then to now. As I said, these things come out as and when. And what I find interesting about Karen's work, not only the content, which is amazing if you have a chance to read these, but it's the way it's being designed. And here we've got the color pink being used on the cover. And it's stapled. It has a smaller piece of paper put on top of it, which is the table of contents for this particular issue. Now, when you think about it, in terms of photocopying, every time you add color, you're adding a few more pence to your cost. And of course, the whole idea is to keep these things as cheap as possible because you're self-funding, so you don't want to expend a lot of money. So to use color, I think, is quite an interesting aspect. What's also great about the cover is how she does a blaze. And I don't think there's any doubt in terms of her enthusiasm and passion being seen through the rather aggressive use of angularity in the typography and, of course, the punctuation mark of the exclamation point. Now, in a recent interview with Kaz Blaze, Karen reflects, for a long time, a blaze was a one-woman operation, and it was the cutting and pasting of it and the selection of things that I used to throw into the mix with the design. And she adds, I don't know if it was as important as the words, but it was really important. And I think as you look through the history of zines, content and form are very much working in tandem with each other. They don't work against each other. So what is being said in terms of its politics and its positioning is also being quite well represented visually in terms of how the type is being used, the kind of humanization of the use of the handwritten typography and lettering and so forth. So if we look at a comparison between a Riot Grrrl zine, Rebel Girl Punk, and an early punk fanzine by Mark Perry, you can begin to see that there is a graphic language of politics emerging, even though they're quite separate generations of producers. Now, the singer Courtney Love emerges alongside Wonder Woman as the representation of a strong, independent woman. And in a way, Courtney became the Wonder Woman for the Riot Grrrl movement. At the same time, the ways in which hand-drawn hearts, stars, and reproduced images of the character Hello Kitty, the use of safety pins, which is a nod back to punk, began to establish this visual language, which is at the same time feminine and feminist. So it's kind of coming back to some of those early observations about Wonder Woman herself and girls in comics. Now, in a similar manner, this cover is Sniffing Glue by Mark Perry, which is the punk one. Rebel Girl uses handwriting titles and photographic image of the musicians, which are also featured inside. And moving on, then we see Sister Yes, and then next to that, a copy of Ripped and Torn. And Tony Drayton was the producer of the punk zine Ripped and Torn, and here he's got a picture of Susie Sue on the front of it. And then we've got Sister Yes, again, Courtney Love, but of course this very dynamic graphic image of exactly what she thinks of the people photographing her. Again, it's very much about looking at a language which is being provocative, being somewhat aggressive, but it's a way of actually establishing the kind of position of its producer and of the notion that women themselves can go out and do it, just like their punk brothers in some case had done previously. Now I want to come back to this. So Wonder Woman continues to be a thread throughout feminist history. This is Vaginal Teeth, and it was produced by Kaz Blaze and several others as part of a conference they had looking at Riot Grrrl. And the typography in this particular zine has a role to play in its creation of this new language. It is often hand-drawn, and it moves between handwriting and these classic jagged letter forms. It's the return to Wonder Woman, where her lasso was replaced by a medical instrument, the speculum. Now, irony as a graphic and literary device became equally important for Riot Grrrl as it was for 1960s and 70s underground broadsheets, and as we saw, the pages of Ms. magazine. This is, again, a great publication if you ever have a chance to look at it. Now, what happens when girls grow up? The Riot movement, there's been many, many great organizers involved in it, and they've set up legacy of fanzine collections. There's been fanzine symposium and music events. But by 2000, Riot Grrrl supporters began to think, what does it mean to begin to growing up? So these were some of the girls that had been involved in the 1993 onwards, and by 2000 were beginning to go to university, have their own lives, and kind of move forward in their thinking. But in 2000, Riot Grrrl supporters organized the first Lady Fest. And so the notion of the riot girl becoming a lady was quite important. And these conventions emerged where they could continue their dialogues, but under the banner of Lady Fest conventions. The first one was in Olympia, Washington. And as the women that created it felt that they were growing up and needed an alternative way of bringing their community together. Since then, events have been held around the world, including Leeds in 2014. So again, there's been a very strong riot girl movement, Leeds Bradford, that's really, really important to recognize, particularly as you're living here and attending the university. Right, so what does this all mean in terms of design and feminism? And what actually is the politics of design? So I'd like to turn to the last part of my talk, which is focusing on a brief discussion of feminism and the politics of design, but through my own London-based collective, which is the Women's Design and Research Unit, which I co-founded with design educators Sean Cook and Liz McQuiston. And we called it the Women's Design and Research Unit for a very particular reason. We wanted to hark back to the first British design consultancy team set up in 1942 by Misha Black, Milner Gray, and Herbert Reed. And these are very key people that in terms of graphic design, industrial design, and art history that you should know about in the 1940s. They really set Britain off to a path of very good design work, which continues today. Now, WDRU was founded in 1994, the same year that the Spice Girls laid claim to the slogan Girl Power, and when the feminist music movement Riot Grrrl gained international momentum. Now, the graphic and typographic design world at the time was heavily male-dominated. Designers were in their black turtlenecks and trendy spectacles. And WDRU had a reason to come together. We were concerned about safeguarding women's voices in visual communication. We knew we could not take on the whole world. We wanted to work at a very micro and local level because we felt that if we could make a little ripple, then perhaps if everybody was making little ripples, we would at some point have a large ripple to actually impact change. So we wrote a manifesto. It called for the opening up of a dialogue with those who were interested or actively engaged in research or practice involving women working in design. That meant both men and women. WDRU has never been restrictive in that way. So in looking back, WDRU was part of an emerging participatory culture. We were interested in collective action as educators and designers. Our first entry into collective action was through the experimental typeface Pussy Galore for Neville Brody's Fuse magazine. Pussy was named after the femme fatale heroine played by Honor Blackman in the James Bond film Goldfinger. And we found this prostitute card years later, which also they named themselves Pussy Galore. But no necessary correlation at the beginning of our research. As an experimental typeface, she, and along with others in her entourage, were based on vernacular icons such as the female and male toilet signs. Computer technology aided her in establishing a forum where users were invited to construct a gendered language by typing out the letter forms on a keyboard. Pussy Galore started out as a bit of fun, but with a serious purpose. She had no idea she would become so famous. This is some of the characters that we created, looking at different taxonomy of women's language. Now, of late, Pussy Galore has become a specimen of study by scholars and feminist historians. She became the subject of interviews and case studies found online and in books on semiotics, feminist history, and postmodernism, published in Brazil, the USA, France, and the UK. She is currently forming part of a research study on icons taking place in Norway and has been featured in countless numbers of BA and MA theses on women working in design. And here's the last set of that. So it runs from A to Z. So every time you hit the keyboard, there's a corollary icon that comes up. So you end up using words and sentences which are completely made out of the different icons, all talking about feminist language. One day in 2009, a design curator at the Pompidou Center in Paris took note of Pussy Galore. she was asked to be part of Elle at Centre Pompidou, an exhibition of women artists and designers. The exhibition attempted to show the development of modern art through the female perspective. Pussy Galore was proud to be in the company of designers including Irma Boom and Susanna Lico, as well as artists Merritt Oppenheim, the Guerrilla Girls, and Rachel Whitread. Pussy Galore became part of what was claimed by one reviewer as a minor feminist art revolution. Pussy Galore has now taken up permanent residency as part of the French National Library collection. And we have tried to kill her off again and again and again. She keeps coming back, though. So there's something in the simplicity of toilet loo signs that still works today, that still resonates with an audience. So she continues to appear in various guises. Now I'd like to turn to two projects that WDRU was involved with. One was called Handing Down the Memory Cloth, which took place in 2006 and was a research project. And then a more recent project, the 48-hour Twitter challenge, which we did for the Victoria and Albert Museum. Now, the first project, Handing Down the Memory Cloth, was a funded research project, and it was funded by the Royal Female School of Art Foundation, which intended to bring together a number of communities, all of whom were located around the Elephant and Castle in South London. It's a very diverse group of communities. The focus was on craft in these communities and how craft could bring communities together. It was an amazing exploration into cultural identity and the role of women in craft and design history. And our participants included women from the Waterloo Action Center, some of our craft makers here. These were great little, you could put kisses inside of them and give them away as gifts, and they were all hand knit by this gal. We also worked with the Bengali Women's Group and learned a great deal about embroidery and the tradition of embroidery. And we also worked with the guys at I Knit London, which is a male-led collective for knitters that takes place in London. And finally, we worked with students and staff at the London College of Communication, where I was based previously. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do, it was a very complex project, and I'll show a visualization of the project itself in its totality in a minute. But one of the things we were quite interested in doing was how could we take the fanzine and these ideas of participatory culture and bring it back into the college? So how do we get communities to come into an institution of education, which is normally kind of seen as, outside a frame of reference for many of the people in South London? So we wanted to bring people in to make a fanzine. And the idea was make a fanzine in a day where anyone could contribute. So we had big signs out on the front of the building asking people to come in if they wanted to participate. Now the catch was, if you provided a page for the fanzine, at the end of the day, you would get a complete issue of that fanzine. So you got a takeaway. But it also encouraged people to stay and get involved in many of the activities that we had going on. Workshops in how to do henna hand painting, workshops in knitting, workshops in cupcake baking. I mean, we had a full range of activities taking place. We also had, prior to the communities coming into the college, look at our own kind of network of individuals, artists and designers. And prior to this, we asked that community to contribute a page. So we already started the fanzine with a set of drawings and design pieces done by a number of very well-known, both men and women, designers and illustrators that we were working with previously. And this all came down into this publication, which was inserted into a paper bag, all the individual pages, which celebrated everybody that had been involved with it, and then we handed these out. They went like fire, as you can imagine. I think I just got one copy left, and we must have done around 100 and so on the day. We had hand letterpress going and silk screening, all sorts of stuff going on. We ended up getting the sewing machine out as well, because we felt it was important to put that kind of idea, and they were all sealed at the top by sewing over it, so you literally had to break it open to get back into it. So this was one of the multiple outcomes that we had as a result of this project. So this is what the project looked like in terms of the number of people involved in the different kinds of communities. And I know you can't see in detail, but it is naming absolutely every individual we engaged with at one level or another, from students to the directors of the various centers that we were working with. And it was so important for us that there were all these little connections that were taking place. And some of the feedback we had from some of the community organizers were that this was the first time that these communities had actually come together in one space. So right there, we felt that we had made a significant contribution to what was going on in South London at the time. So that was one kind of project that we were involved with. The second project I'd like to talk about is the 48-hour Twitter challenge, which we did as part of the VNA's Design Salon in 2014. And as we're coming up to International Women's Day, I thought this might be appropriate, as this particular project was conceived for the Inspire Change for Women in Design as part of the celebrations of International Women's Day in 2014. And we teamed up with the graphic designer Tori Hinn, who recently graduated from RISD in the US. And her thesis project, she had actually created a website called Women of Graphic Design. And we were very interested in terms of looking at what she might be able to bring to our conversations and vice versa. So between us, we used our Twitter accounts to raise awareness about women working in design, but also to find out what others considered the main issues to be. And as I'm sure everybody knows, Twitter's quite good for asking questions and getting immediate responses back. We alternated block times for tweeting, taking into consideration the time zones between the East Coast of the US and London. And so for that 48 hours, there was a constant Twitter stream taking place with questions and responses from many contributors. And we're still sifting through the results of this project, and we had a good number of retweets, and Tori noted that the traffic to her website was substantially increased. But just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that were coming out of the participants' ideas about the challenge itself, and women in design in particular. Participants included individual designers, both men and women, plus a number of US and UK women's collectives in the design-related fields. We had a number of key American and British women's collectives joining in and retweeting to their followers, so this obviously helped increase our conversations and our reach as well. And general themed issues emerged and were treated primarily as questions rather than as direct responses. And we noted that most mirrored the similar concerns that our predecessors of early 1970s feminism had also experienced. So some of the key issues which emerged had to do under the theme of societal and professional challenges. So for example, is it a value to have a degree in design, or is it a value not to have a degree? Are there more women or more men in graphic design? Do they come from the North or the South? And this was interesting, both in the US and the UK, having a North-South conversation taking place geographically. How do we encourage more women into design? Does age make a difference? Are women less visible? What about if you have children and you're being required to work evenings or on weekends? Is there casual sexism from some of your clients? Does work equal work? Is there discrimination against women in the design industry? So these were all topics that were repeatedly coming up as the Twitter challenge continued. So I've got an example of some of the responses from some of the individuals that were involved. Astrid, who is a very well-known designer in Europe, she was saying, "Thank you for addressing such a cliche, complicated, and poignant subject. Looking forward to a world where work equals work." And so again, that was her experiences in terms of raising some of the issues around that area. And that got retweeted quite a bit, actually. Another category was obviously about establishing and questioning the canon of women in design. And we had lots of tweets which dealt with naming who your kind of most inspirational graphic designer woman might be, and these were some of the responses from that. And we were quite interested that not all the responses tended to be the well-known figures in graphic design, And I think that's really, really important that there are multiple voices from very diverse backgrounds that are also included in the list. It's not always the great women of history as the great men in history. And again, here's a list of some of the people that Catherine Dixon, if you know her, she works at Central St. Martin's, tweeted for us. She was quite active in our tweet-a-thon. And another one from Tim Fenley, if you know the Legible London Project, information designer, he has been involved in that. And of course, he had to name his wife, who's a very well-respected designer from Mulberry. And finally, it was interesting in terms of the kind of divide between the canon in relationship to both European and US-centric women that were being named through Twitter. So this raised for us a really interesting issue that I think we'll take on to another kind of project, is looking how do we actually find out more about what's going on in other countries, that there really does tend to be a very strong axis between the US and Europe, but that's not necessarily where all the good design is taking place or where women are actually being challenged by their particular conditions and need a voice in that debate. We had a number of collectives involved, as well as I said earlier, and this is a list of some of them, all very, very wonderful gals who do actively tweet, and so they're worth following if you want to find out what's going on in the industry and you're interested in jobs and professional careers. These are some of the organizations you might want to hook into. And here's the question that actually came from Francisco Laranjo, who is the editor of Modes of Criticism. So again, he was helping us out of Portugal kind of look at some of these issues that he had encountered in his own dealings with graphic design in Portugal. So our intent was to explore the kind of reach that social media would provide for discussing issues and raising new questions about women working in the design profession. Twitter was one tool through which we were able to disseminate and raise awareness as a catalyst for collective action. We felt it was also important not only to engage with these issues in digital form, but to also bring these to a forum with others who were interested in exploring similar themes. And with this in mind, we participated in the Design Culture Salon series run by Guy Julier at the V&A, where the panel was presented with the question, what are the gender politics of contemporary design practice? And if you go to the V&A site under the Design Culture Salon, you'll see a review of that particular panel discussion with designers like Simon Brewster talking about how she's often thought of as Simon as opposed to Simone, names and gender identity and what that meant for her professionally as a designer. So a rather interesting transcript, so I do encourage you to have a look at that. Now, according to some academics, there are three basic functions to all collective action. The first is a means to identify people with relevant potential interest in public good. The second is a means of communicating messages commonly perceivable amongst them. And the third is a means of coordinating, integrating, or synchronizing their contributions. So I think Twitter has very much done that for us. And the project, the Challenge Project, was important for WDRU because it was less about focusing on the big names, but creating a space for multiple voices and stories about women in graphic design from a range of perspectives. The aim of the Twitter conversation and the V&A forum was to raise a debate and work across generations. Digital tools have actually challenged established forms of publishing as well as dissemination. But they also are giving rise to providing a new visibility for women working in design. Now, lastly, one of our participants in the original Twitter challenge has now curated an exhibition at Central St. Martin's, which brings into focus 100 years of graphic communication by women who are either staff or students at the college. As part of the opening of the show, CSM have a Twitter feed and have been putting out calls for followers to send in names of women working in design now and in the past. This initiative has already drawn criticism from commentators who are still asking, why do we still need female-only exhibitions? However, The success of the show and the conversation that it has generated is proof that we still do. Thank you. It's always hard to talk when there's a lot of people. No questions? No comments? Yeah.
Blaze here today. She's from Leeds. These were published from Leeds, from the Heralds, about a mile away down there. I helped cut and paste them with her.
Excellent. There you go.
I know her really well.
Yeah. No, I mean, Blaze is absolutely fantastic, and what she's done for the zine community has just been terrific.
She was. She was the
Yeah.
force of nature in Leeds at that period.
Yeah,
She
yeah.
really was.
And it's great to see I haven't seen the most recent copy. I don't know if you have.
I've just seen the compilation. I mean, they're going on the record shop for the kind of compilation of all the Blaze from kind of 88 onwards.
Yeah. So, yeah, a lot of the zine producers did put them together as books. Their zines ended up as books because the writing was so amazing as well. And so it was an opportunity to kind of have a new audience for that writing as well. So, but yeah, no, no, she's fantastic.
Do you think that Riot Girl really was a kind of, I mean, you say it owed a lot to 70s feminism, the second wave feminism. I mean, being in the middle of it, it seemed like it was actually much more kind of strident, much more radical in some ways. You know, I mean, going to Riot Girl gigs as a man, I was often kind of like, it was quite a strange thing. You were often kind of stared at and forced out the door and things like that.
Yeah.
You know, I thought it was really interesting. And my mother's a second wave feminist, and she would never have gone for that kind of, you know, stridency.
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on where and who you were engaging with in the Riot Girl community. Because I was going to gigs, like in Scotland when they had the big Riot Girl festival, or Lady Fest, they were actually welcoming men to join in. And you would, I mean, what was kind of brilliant is you would see the boyfriends coming along with the girls on classes on menstruation, and everybody talking about it collectively. So there didn't seem to be that kind of, you know, whereas 70s feminism, you did get the sense that it was a lot of radical feminists who just didn't want guys in the building because they didn't understand. So I think it depends on where you were in terms of how the kind of community itself was receptive or not receptive. And fair enough, sometimes it really is just about a group of women or a group of men getting together and talking about very specific issues and not having those other kind of interventions taking place.
And I mean, part of it implicitly is, do you think that that level of participatory kind of is anticipated the internet? Because I thought it did, in the sense when the internet came along, it was like, oh, we already had this,
Yeah.
zines, and kind of
Yeah.
there was already that network established there of kind of you know, same level, same platform, same, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting about it is what the internet did for that pre-existing community was to increase its visibility and its access. So very much what they wanted to do was to kind of reach other like-minded individuals. But I think there was a kind of rejection of the zines just going up on the internet. It was about maybe advertising the fact that they had these zines or having short blog postings about what the zines were doing. But it's the printed artifact. Everybody came back to that and that tactility and the kind of way that when you went to a gig, you could hand out your zine to somebody. So you were physically engaging and participating in that kind of way, which is why it was important for us that, you know, when we did the Twitter challenge, that we actually came back together as a community and had that conversation face to face. So I think the internet's great, but you need to talk with each other and, have that kind of more physical discussions. I think it's really important.
And Teal, was that then documented in print? That the Twitter 48 hours, was that then?
Yeah, Lee Armstrong has done a kind of commentary on the issues that were raised by each of the panelists as well.
Because I was just interested when you were talking about that project, do you think the printed medium to highlight those political or sociological issues is altered now, not only just by the impact of social media, but the blurring of boundaries between scenes and artists and designers, sort of artist books, sort of the emphasis of it changing its impact graphically?
Yeah, well, if I understand what you're saying, those boundaries have blurred.
Yeah.
And I often wonder if, because the internet's now out there, that we're seeing the kind of backlash to the internet now, and that we're seeing more people wanting to engage with the printed materials. It was interesting, I was having a conversation with one of the big UK publishers and asking them, since, the Kindle has come out and all the books that you can read online, has that really impacted their publishing profits? And he said, no, we've actually gone up because more people now want the physical object because they know what the digital experience is, but now they actually want the thing itself. That's for all different reasons. So I think that's quite interesting.
Because often it can feel like the Twitter side can sort of embrace that cut and paste mentality, the quickness of the reaction, and then the print seems to be documented. Do you know?
Yeah, but I think the intents are quite different. I mean, the Twitter in many cases is about just an idea you had, the immediacy of that, you got it out, and that's the end of it. Some things, as we know, get picked up and kind of rehashed, by the retweets. But then that again disappears quite quickly. It's very fleeting. Whereas it's one kind of conversation. It's like your corridor conversation. Hi, guy. It's good to see you, and you're off. Where the printed book is really sitting in the library and having a different kind of conversation. And they can work in tandem. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I kind of have a question. So when you talk about Riot Girl being like a participatory movement, etc., was it actually though? I knew you were talking about men being excluded, but from my knowledge of it, I didn't say I was a Riot Girl because it was heavily transphobic, and especially people like Kathleen Hanna from Bikini Kill, she was notably pretty transphobic, and I don't know if that's exclusionary in itself. Do you know what I mean? I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that side of things.
Well, it comes back to kind of what I was mentioning at the beginning of the talk with the responses back to Gloria Steinem, Hillary Clinton's campaign and so forth. Who are you excluding and who are you including? And I think any time that you bring a group of people together, that decision is being made, whether it's nuanced or whether it's quite overt. And I think what's important is that we recognize that. And in part, it's human nature. But I think in terms of participatory cultures, the mindset is that we can be open, that we can allow people to involve themselves within these particular projects or ideas.
I feel like the Riot Girl movement has maybe evolved and could be accepting of people that it was known in the 90s of being specifically exclusionary of, and women of colour as well were not so much represented. It was very cisgender white women, and I just do you think
as 70s feminism was as well, absolutely.
Yeah. Do you think now that Riot Girl, we can talk about the fact that it was exclusionary then, but it could be kind of reborn and not be the same? I don't know.
Well, one would hope, as I was saying, not all Riot Girl groups took these positions, so we have to be quite careful. And, we're generalizing all sorts of things for ease of life at the moment. But it is a very complex thing, and you're rightly pointing out the very nuanced aspects of communities coming together and what happens when they come together. I think in terms of what's happening with Riot Girl now, that's why I was hoping you guys would tell me what is happening. I'm obviously of a different generation, and my access to Riot Girl communities is through various individuals that I've stayed in touch with from, like Kaz Blaze and so forth. But in terms of what's happening right now, I will have to leave that to colleagues to respond to. I would hope there is more of a tolerance, more of an understanding. But as I said, when communities do come together, there are certain parameters that are set just by the very fact the design community can be quite exclusive as well. So it's being aware of that and recognizing that, and I think that'll help us be much more inclusive ultimately. But if anybody has the answer to what's happening with Riot Girl now,
I don't really think it's a thing so much anymore. I think people kind of look back on it, and maybe the people that were involved still kind of, I don't know. For me, I don't really feel. I read stuff like zines and things, but it's not really.
So in a way, it's generational. time frame as well, perhaps. I know there's still lady fests that pop up every so often internationally. So something's still happening. It's just maybe not as visible at this moment. But yeah, good questions.
It kind of
Okay.
touches on her subject as well. But do you think that at the start you were saying about like we and I, that people that are involved in it, you can take like with feminism, you've got the men obviously commenting on it as well. Do you think their views can be accepted in it, or do you think you need to kind of fit the criteria to have a say in it kind of thing? Or do you think like it detracts from it being about women having men in the like feminist group?
That's a loaded question. I can talk from WDRU's perspective. Maybe that's the best way of doing it, because I can't speak for every women's group. We made a very conscious decision that in the design community, we felt that there had been long enough a division between women's engagement in industry, professional practice, how they were being viewed, how they were being written about historically, that we wanted to ensure we opened that up. And we've done that through collaborations. Not all projects have men involved in it. And that's not necessarily by design, but that's by interest in working with specific collaborators that can bring something to the discussion. So in a way, that's kind of our criteria. How can we bring people in to learn from, and what might they learn from us, and then how can we collectively produce something that actually makes a statement or has a particular kind of intent that's realized. So we're very conscious about engagement, but engagement with people. And I think I think Sean would probably agree that we've probably taken a strong feminist position, but moving towards humanism as where we're positioned now. We just celebrated our 21st birthday last year, and I think that's been very interesting in reflecting back on what we have done over 21 years, and then what we might do in the next 21 years, if we're still around. And we do have a Tumblr site, if you're interested, which is just WD and RU, Tumblr. Whatever it calls itself.com. Which has all the projects we've been involved with. And so you can kind of go through and see that here and there's some really interesting projects that we've done in collaboration with the guys. But because they were good designers or writers or illustrators, they brought something to the conversation. And that was the most important thing for us, and still is.